Hey guys, Morgan Radford here, correspondent for NBC News. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier today, we really want to talk about a group of people that you may not really heard much about. And those are people who are affected by domestic violence, a group that has also been disproportionately affected when it comes to this pandemic, and specifically National Domestic Violence Hotline. And this is someone who can talk to us about what exactly is going on. Hi there, how are you?
Hi.
You made it so quickly on the Instagram live connection. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being with us. If you don't mind, I was just introducing you. Will you tell everyone
Absolutely.
your name and your title in the National Domestic Violence Hotline?
Sure. So I'm Crystal Justice, and I'm the Chief Development and Marketing Officer here at the hotline. And I'm so glad to join you today on Instagram Live.
Crystal, it's a pleasure to have you with us. And, we've been doing a lot of reporting on this story, and basically the way that the pandemic and the stay-at-home order specifically have really been affecting people who are suffering from domestic violence or trapped in abusive situations. Can you please explain the relationship between the stay-at-home orders and that group of people?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, stay-at-home orders, social distancing is all necessary in this pandemic to keep us as safe as possible from the virus. But as we all know, there's unintended consequences, and part of that is survivors being forced to shelter in place or in close proximity with their abuser. And as a result, they're at higher risk for experiencing perhaps more severe abuse or experiencing abuse with more frequency.
And for people kind of to paint a picture for them, the idea is also that if you're inside and say you have an abusive partner and he or she is now dealing with financial stress because maybe they don't have a job or insecurity about where their next check is going to come from, then you're trapped inside a volatile environment, right? Can you describe what the nature of some of the calls that you're receiving? Because we know that you guys have seen a spike in calls, but police departments have also seen a spike in these calls.
Yeah, so we know any situation that adds fear, financial strain, and isolation can cause issues for survivors in their relationships, especially if their abuser is an intimate partner. And this pandemic is a combination of all three. And so we're hearing everything from abusers really weaponizing the pandemic, restricting even their victim who might be an essential worker from going to work, really stopping them from using some of the safety products and hygiene that we're using every day. For example, not letting them have access to antibacterial soap, not letting them go to the doctor if they're showing signs of COVID. And then in some instances, we've seen survivors actually be kicked out of their home when the symptoms they're experiencing might just be allergies or might be a simple cold. But again, their abuser is just using it as a weapon. So that's what we're hearing directly from survivors. Just any way an abuser can use this as a tactic to further abuse and control is what we're seeing. And it's really, really heartbreaking.
And it's disturbing. Crystal, in those circumstances, what do you all tell people? What do you tell them to do?
Yeah. Well, it's really important to know that survivors are strong and resilient. And so what we really do is our best to transfer power back to them. We focus on the things in their lives that they can control and the decisions that they can make. And so a lot of what we do is share information. In the pandemic, a lot of what we've been doing is correcting the narrative on what their abuser might be saying that simply is not true. So, for example, it's perfectly legal for you to go to the grocery store. It's perfectly legal for you to take a walk outside. We see abusers saying that it's not. And so a lot of what we've been doing is setting the record straight with survivors. And the other group that we're working a lot with is we see a lot of people who are reaching out on behalf of survivors in their lives because they want to know how they can best help them in this situation.
Can you also talk a little bit, Crystal, about some of the newer initiatives that states and counselors are using and doing to reach these survivors. For example, in some of our reporting, we've talked to people that are saying, for example, here in New York, they're working with pharmacies to make sure that pharmacy workers, those essential businesses that are open, are now prepared and trained to recognize signs of domestic violence. And they are now have your number, as well as, the domestic violence hotline that goes through the police department here. So they're doing something new, right? You would typically think of walking into a pharmacy or a grocery store and having a worker trained to spot these signs. What other initiatives are you seeing across the country that these groups are utilizing, because we're in such a new normal?
Yeah, and I think one thing that this pandemic has done is really raise the awareness of the experience of survivors that even have nothing to do with pandemic, right? All of us are probably encountering or know survivors in our life, and so we're thinking of ways we can support them. So we're seeing a lot of, first of all, local providers on the ground, shelters, counselors, doing as much as they can digitally, and really supporting survivors in every digital way that they can. And then, yeah, we're seeing other organizations and businesses in the community want to know that they can help. And so they're, in some cases, they're using just in questions, do you feel safe at home? Is there anything I can do to support you? Do you have a safety plan? That's a lot of what we're sharing, is how do you talk to someone about safety planning, particularly when they're living with their abuser, and that trip to the pharmacy. Yeah, that trip to the pharmacy or the grocery store might be the only time away that they get from that abuser. And so we're really sharing as much information as we can, and that it's really important not to judge a survivor, not to tell them what they should or should not do, but just to be there and be supportive and listen and see how you can play a part in their being as safe as possible.
So, another question, kind of switching gears, Crystal, as we're talking about domestic violence, a lot of these groups, these organizations rely on fundraising, and all these fundraising events have been canceled. I mean, do you guys have the resources you need to help?
Yeah, so for us, I think, we are, let me just tell you about our call volume. So for the month of March, we actually didn't see a significant spike in call volume, but we weren't expecting to, because we knew that shelter-in-place orders were going to put survivors in a situation where they didn't feel safe reaching out. We're already starting to see, as shelter-in-place orders are laxing, that our contact volume is spiking. And so as a matter of fact, yesterday we had the highest contact volume of the year. And so the simple answer is no. We don't have all the resources to answer this significant spike in contact volume as it's coming in. So we're averaging more than 14,500 calls, chats, and texts a week. And so we don't have enough staff at this point to answer every one of those contacts as they're coming in. We also know that local providers, shelters, they're also needing additional resources as they're doing the best they can on the ground in providing shelter and essential services to survivors. So right now, if people are inclined to support anything philanthropically, I think the needs of survivors are front and center.
Crystal, I have to thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, this is just a group that I feel like we have not heard a lot about, and people who, are familiar with these situations said, I've interviewed two people who said, look, when I heard these stay-at-home orders were going in place, I knew people were going to think about the economy, they were going to think about childcare, but their brain, they said, immediately went to this place and how unsafe it would be. And as soon as you hear it and you understand the spike in calls, it becomes so logical. Like, why didn't we think of that before? So, I mean, thank you for shedding light on something that I think a lot of us weren't initially aware of, right? As we're trying to navigate this new phase. So thank you.
And I think for us, once all of this starts to lift, we have to continue to remember that home isn't always safe. And so the long-term effects of COVID, and quite frankly, domestic violence, has been an epidemic that has gone on for way too long. And so we really need to remember what we're feeling now and how we can continue to support survivors even after this is passed.
Crystal Justice, National Domestic Violence Hotline, thank you so much for joining us. We have more on this reporting coming up on today's show tomorrow, so we hope you can join in. We'll be playing that piece at 8 o'clock, which shows a lot of our reporting. We'll talk to people who are survivors of domestic violence and talk about how this pandemic has affected this group of people. Thank you so much for joining us, Crystal, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Morgan.
Bye.